Obviously, I have to make it lighter. Let's push it back up and not light it up.
Yeah, you get one screen to go out.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Julian Triggs. I'm the President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, and it's a very, very great pleasure for me to welcome you all to another in our series of Rights Talks, which have been successful. We're always pleased to see so many of you coming into the building from your various work or studies here in Sydney. We're, of course, very grateful to have these wonderful premises right in the heart of Sydney. People can join us for these events or later in the day relatively easily, and so it's particularly appropriate for me to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to respect their elders past and present. Well, I think we're in for a great treat today because we have a marvellous speaker, Professor David Kinley, who's going to talk to us about his new research project on the establishment of a new human right on freedom from corruption. Now, this is, of course, an important subject at the domestic level. We are very well aware, of course, in New South Wales of the work of ICAC's investigation into public sector fraud in this state, the Heydon Royal Commission into union finances, and the ongoing criminal investigations into bribery allegations against various companies, particularly Leighton Holdings. Kofi Annan has described this form of corruption, at least that's being alleged, as a global plague. And his concerns are really backed up by absolutely astonishing financial statistics that I'm sure that David will elaborate on. But apparently the illicit funds, financial funds, flowing out of developing countries in the last 10 years is about $8.5 trillion US, which is more than 10 times those countries received in aid, and equivalent to the total of all direct foreign investment into developing countries over that period. Now, David knows a great deal more about this than I do. He'll elaborate. But corruption, in its various forms, is indeed a form of plague. And one of the arguments that David makes is that an approach to responding to corruption can lie in a human rights approach, which, of course, is the very thing we're most concerned with here at the Australian Human Rights Commission. And he will elaborate on the establishment of a new right. Now, in welcoming David for this presentation in RightsTalk, of course, I'm really welcoming David back because he was a former senior research fellow. I'm not sure of your title actually. With what was HERIOC in the past, now of course the Australian Human Rights Commission. But David cut his teeth, I think, here before he went to become the founding director of the Caston Centre of Human Rights Law at Monash University in Melbourne. David really is one of the foremost human rights lawyers for Australia, but also globally. He holds the chair in human rights law at the University of Sydney, and I was, having known David for many years before in his HERIOC days, I was delighted as Dean at Sydney Law School to know that David had that chair in human rights law at the Sydney Law Faculty. He's also an academic panel member for the Doughty Street Chambers in London, and he's a member of the Australian Council of Human Rights. David's done a great deal of work on looking at the global economy and human rights. And he's written some marvelous books. One of them I strongly recommend, Civilizing Globalization, Human Rights and the Global Economy. That was 2009, and it's a wonderful overview of the way the economy works and the impact that that economy has on the core human rights that we're also concerned about. David's also working on a new book, An Awkward Intimacy, Why Human Rights and Finance Must Learn to Love Each Other. I think your titles must surely help with selling these books. They're marvellous. So it's a great pleasure to welcome David back here to the Commission, but also to have him stretch our minds a little about not only the core rights that we know and understand, but some of the new rights that we need to think about in developing the law that responds to contemporary problems, particularly in the economic arena. Now, we do keep reasonably strictly to time. David's going to speak for about 35 minutes, and then open for questions, and we try to finish around 1:30 so that you can all get back to work or university or wherever you've come from. Thank you very much, and welcome, David.
Thank you very much, Julian, for that generous introduction. And indeed, it is a pleasure to be back here at different premises, but still the same institution, different premises and different name. We all lie and cheat. In the vast majority of cases, it is in minor ways during the course of everyday discourse and interactions. We tell little white lies to our children and to loved ones. We fib to our friends. We tell tales, tall tales about past and present exploits. We are sometimes economical with the truth at work. And students, even law students, appear to suffer terribly and alarmingly with alarming regularity from computer mishaps and deaths of elderly relatives at exam time, which happens to be right now. Tempting though it is to spend the next hour investigating this aspect of social psychology, it is not my concern in this talk. Rather, my first 2 points of focus in the paper is in another type of widely perpetrated fraud. That is, when we fool or fib or fob ourselves. Now here my concern is not with the run-of-the-mill ideas and lies that we tell ourselves on matters that are essentially trivial and private, like how funny or intelligent or generous or hardworking or good-looking we might believe we are or are not. Instead, what I'm interested in is the self-delusion that some practice in respect of actions that are profoundly public and profoundly serious. That is, where the consequences are not only criminal, but also involve breaches of public trust. Specifically, I'm interested in circumstances where individuals fool themselves into believing that their corrupt conduct is somehow legitimate or justifiable or not really corrupt at all. Where, through willful blindness to the facts, they construct an Alice in Wonderland world in which they tell themselves that they are worth it, or that their crimes are victimless, that someone had to win the tender, so why couldn't it be my son? Or what they are taking is only a drop in the ocean, so small that no one will really notice or care. This, I think, is the most insidious and dangerous manifestation of corruption, one that has the enormous potential to self-perpetuate the offence, precisely because the perpetrator fails to see that their actions constitute an offence in the first place. In such circumstances, normal deterrents of criminal law, wrongdoing will be punished, are of little use, their effect having been diluted by the constructed self-righteousness or exceptionalism or perceived innocence of the offender, him or herself. In one of the prison interviews that Bernie Madoff has given since his conviction on fraud charges in 2009, he declared that I was always able to rationalize the fraud, and I did indeed block the fraud out of my mind. Indeed, so successful was he in deceiving himself as well as the countless investors that he managed to construct a Ponzi scheme over at least 20 years that was worth some $50 billion when it collapsed, earning Madoff a 150-year prison term. But Ponzi schemes and frauds like them are directed largely at the private sector rather than the government, though not entirely so, of course, because in Madoff's case, for example, he misled the US Securities and Exchange Commission, he also misled the IRS, and of course he misled many public authorities who invested in his products. But it is when the corrupt conduct in question and the self-delusion that fuels it is directed at the state itself that the gravest implications arise. When public power and all the trust and expectation invested in it is hijacked by private interests, one stands to lose not just financially, but the very foundations of representative and accountable government are undermined. In short, the terms of the social contract between the governed and the governors is broken, and the relationship of trust between them violated. It is here that we reach the second of my points of focus, namely that the wider and deeper consequences of such public corruption tend to result in far more serious human rights consequences and therefore beg for a serious human rights response. A response, what is more, that constitutes more than merely the lament, no matter how earnest and accurate, that corruption leads directly or indirectly to various human rights violations of people and individuals. It does, they are lamentable, and the impact indeed should be condemned. But what, we must ask ourselves, can and should human rights law do to help address the situation? What value can it add to the rafts of existing anti-corruption measures at international and domestic levels? The proposal that I'm going to make in this paper for the establishment of an entirely new, freestanding right to freedom from corruption is one that, while born of a general commitment to have the language of human rights make a clear statement condemning corruption as a breach of a fundamental right, also seeks to claim a degree of practical importance and application. I argue that an unequivocal description of corruption as a violation of a specific human right will operate as a powerful force against the pretensions of self-deniers and delusionists who would otherwise hold their corrupt conduct was excusable. So, having established these two focal points, let me now try and explain how I bring these two aspects of the argument together and provide some level of justification for what I expect or maybe hope would be the impact of the proposal. Corruption, as Yale law professor Susan Rose Ackerman puts it, is a symptom that something has gone wrong with the management of the state. The consequences of such mismanagement can be enormous and are often most serious for those who can least afford it. As Julian mentioned, it has been estimated, for example, that between 2000 and 2009, developing countries lost some $8.44 trillion US to illicit financial flows. This is 10 times what they received during that period under official development assistance, i.e. aid. And this, incidentally, that amount, 8.244 trillion, is about the same that developing world received in foreign direct investment during that period. And while the loss to developing countries of more than $1 trillion each year is significant on its own, it also represents immense failures of governments' delivery of political, social, and economic goals and expectations, including in respect of the realization of human rights. Public and private finance is needed for the realization of the most straightforward as well as the most complex of human rights. Public finance is required to enable the state to implement its direct provision of rights fulfillment in, for example, public education, healthcare, housing, and sanitation. It is also vital to the state's rights-based regulation of the private sector providers of these and other services through representative legislative bodies, public sector bureaucracies, enforcement agencies such as the police and the courts. The critical importance of both the effective and fair governance in any country is well recognized in development circles. Over the past decade or so, the proportion of total global annual overseas development assistance, or official development assistance, dedicated to governance and to the rule of law and capacity building projects has grown to some 25% of all aid. It's no longer just bridges, it's governance. The latest figures from the World Bank's governance and public sector management programs for the fiscal year 2013 reveals that nearly 12%, that is $3.85 billion of the World Bank funds, were targeted specifically at improving public sector institutions and focusing particularly on combating corruption. National budgets, the raising and expenditure of public funds, are critical to the realization of human rights of the poorest and the vulnerable in any society, especially when one considers, for example, the requirement under Article 2.1 of the ICAC, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, to realize those rights to, and here I'm quoting, the maximum of its available resources. Broad-based local taxation systems are essential. They need to cover labour taxes, income tax, corporations tax, export tax, property tax, inheritance tax, and even consumption tax. And that's usually the last to come. The difficulties faced by governments in developing states in establishing even the rudiments of such comprehensive fiscal regimes are manifest and obvious. They are, what is more, especially problematic at the same time when one considers that these countries are trying to attract private investment into their economies, including foreign direct investment. Therefore, the Financial Times, in its 2013 FDI report, points out that in developing countries, there is in fact a direct correlation between increasing levels of corporations tax and decreasing FDI projects. To put it in another way, poor countries find themselves performing a delicate balancing act, whereby the less they tax foreign businesses, the more foreign businesses will invest in their country, and that's clearly a dilemma. In any event, the establishment of a broad-based taxation system is only half the battle. For once it is there, the challenge for most taxpayers the world over is how to minimize its impact. Economists have been commenting for years on how tax departments in many transnational corporations, far from being loss-making, i.e. paying taxes to the state, are in fact profit centers, soaking up costs from other parts of the organization and finding ways to make them tax deductible. The immense grey area between tax evasion and avoidance in many rich world jurisdictions, made bigger and greyer by the forensic skills and ingenuity of tax professionals whose services are avidly sought after by the wealthy, provides ample evidence of the instances of legal corruption whereby tax is legally avoided but unethically evaded. Today, the problem is at least well recognized, if not easily corrected. Thus, the Oxford Martins Commission current report on future generations observes that both the June 2013 G8 and the July 2013 G20 declarations on tax evasion expressly challenged long-standing practices of shifting profits to avoid taxes, the lack of transparency in tax havens, insufficient clarity on company ownership, and the non-reporting of payments made by extractive companies to governments. These economic realities combine to exacerbate the governance gap and prevent much-needed growth within developing countries. Corruption is, however, a problem much wider and deeper than denying the state its rightful pound of taxation flesh. Corruption is about the misappropriation of public monies and the misuse of public powers for the illegitimate benefit of private interests. Through its two main forms, that is petty corruption and grand corruption, corruption can have enormous and malign influences on just about every aspect of society's existence and the daily lives of its people. Petty corruption, bribes demanded by police or low-level officials, for example, is small scale, based on duress, and involves a victim and a perpetrator. Grand corruption, for example, a mining transnational corporation bribing a mines minister in a developing country to sign off on a substantially reduced royalty rate, is large scale, consensual, and based on mutual gain for both perpetrators. The victims here are the state and its people. But in both cases, both examples of corruption, the capacity and the willingness of the perpetrators to rationalize their conduct as fair or appropriate or the best outcome overall is abundant. In many developing countries, ordinary public officials are poorly paid, such that they resort to the main comparative advantage of their position, namely their power to extort. With senior government officials, on the other hand, they will often point to the end, that is, the end result, that is, the mine was built, it provides local employment, and that at least some royalties are being paid into the treasury. They point to those to justify the means they employ, namely the bribery that oil the wheels of the deal. But corruption's breadth is such that it is by no means unique to developing countries. As a country becomes industrialized, its governance and corruption challenges, the challenges of corruption and governance do not disappear. They simply morph and become more sophisticated. They become deeper and more subtle, focusing on exerting influence and capture of public power when, for example, private sector lobbyists can exert direct influence on public policy choices. Or, as is vividly demonstrated during the global financial crisis, where the public regulators are blinded by the very financiers they are supposed to be regulating with enticements of future lucrative jobs in their companies, the revolving door syndrome. The prevailing response from the financial sector to the debacle, to the global financial crisis, is that the economic bad times are the price to be paid for the wealth created during the good times. That's an excellent illustration of the delusional tactics in action. This becomes even more clear when one considers the essential rider to this line of reasoning, namely that the state or the public funds behind it must rescue private losses, and that the payment of high-level bonuses must be maintained in order to ensure that the talent, the financial talent, is retained, and that we are all saved thereby from falling deeper into financial purgatory. That's the argument of many bankers. And all of this, Australia is no exception, either in respect of blue or white-collar corruption. In its 2012 review of Australia's compliance with the OECD Bribery Convention, the OECD was highly critical of the paucity of bribery and corruption cases prosecuted under relevant corporate and criminal legislation. At the time, there was only the Reserve Bank notes case, although it has now been joined, as Julian mentioned, by Leighton Holdings. The OECD further called for an overhaul of legislation to impose a greater burden of proof for compliance on corporations, rather than, as is presently the case, the burden of proof falling on the authorities to substantiate breach. In Australia, we have problems of petty corruption, albeit not, at least not very often, in the form of bribes demanded by police or minor officials, as in poor states, but more we have it as tax evasion, fraud, and illicit enrichment. The current ICAC inquiry into public sector fraud in New South Wales amply illustrates the point, as one would like to think, or one maybe not like to think, but one knows, will be forthcoming in the Commonwealth's Royal Commission into the construction industry. We also have problems of grand corruption. Again, less, but not zero. I think that's important to note. Again, less in the form of the theft of public monies and the solicitation of kickbacks by politicians and senior officials, as is the case in many developing countries, and more by way of transfer pricing, insider dealing, political donations, shell companies, and ask no questions, money laundering. To take but one example, Sam Cohen, the head of P&G's anti-corruption task force, has repeatedly stated that tens of millions of dollars that he has unearthed gained from illicit activities of P&G businessmen are being laundered through Australian banks on a regular basis. Indeed, stepping back to look at the broader picture, it would be naive to think that the largest repositories of illicit funds are to be found in the bank vaults of the small tax haven states, such as Andorra, the Bahamas, the British Virgin Islands, the Caymans, and the Seychelles, or indeed even in those states with the tightest secrecy laws, such as Hong Kong and Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, or Switzerland. In fact, the countries of preference for laundering ill-gotten gains are the OECD states, Australia included, precisely because of the perception that their financial laundering services produce the cleanest financial results. Perhaps what is most remarkable about this circumstance is not so much that such services are illegal, some are, and some are duly cancelled or reported, but that much of it sails under the radar, either because of insufficient due diligence being carried out by the banks on the provenance of the deposits taken or the investments made, or that no such scrutiny is required, and so, no matter what one suspects to be the case, a blind eye is turned and the transaction obtains a cloak of legality and of respectability. Jason Sharman of Griffith University has shown just how causally extensive the phenomenon of offshore banking institutions headquartered in Western states is. Posing as a wealthy investor seeking anonymity and tax minimization and asset protection, he approached more than 200 offshore providers from both small state and so-called secrecy jurisdictions, as well as OECD jurisdictions. Of the OECD countries, 47 providers gave valid responses, i.e. they were prepared to discuss the options. And of those, no fewer than 35 agreed to form shell companies without requiring any identification documents. 24 of those were in the United States, and 8 of them were in the United Kingdom. All were in direct contravention of the Financial Action Task Force's recommendation, a recommendation that's held up to all developing and developed countries, requiring states to establish and enforce rules that identify clearly beneficial ownership in company structures. The rules governing legal tax avoidance, as opposed to illegal tax evasion, in many advanced economies are another example of such permissive regulatory standards, what Danny Kaufman, an anti-corruption expert formerly of the World Bank, calls legal corruption. The tax minimization practices of Starbucks and Google in the United Kingdom, for example, are a case in point. The enthusiastic and extensive use of tax havens by many of Australia's biggest companies, as revealed by ABC's 730 report a couple of years ago on the Global Tax Justice Network, are another example of tax rationalization strategies which likely or arguably remain legal while failing societal expectations of morality and fairness. And to hammer home the point, Warren Buffett, third richest man on earth, tells the story of a small survey that he conducted in which he asked all the people working in his office, management, analysts, administrative assistants, receptionists, etc., to declare their individual marginal income tax rate. It turned out that when they did, he had the lowest, 17.7%, the average being 32.9%. So how can this be so, he asked himself? Because, as Buffett explains, such tax leniency for the rich is a cardinal, quite intentional feature of the horrifyingly complex US federal tax code. There are 3.8 million words in the US federal tax code. I have no tax planning, he added. I just follow what the US Congress tells me to do. We can see, therefore, that fooling oneself into believing that one's conduct is not really corruption occurs when one is in fact engaging in corrupt conduct as legally defined. But equally, the manner in which some laws governing bribery, fraud, and corruption are framed makes such self-delusion very easy indeed, if necessary at all. The human rights work that has been undertaken in this field has focused almost exclusively on the detrimental impact corruption has on existing human rights, how corruption operates as a means to violate existing rights such as fair trial, non-discrimination, access to essential services and goods like food, water, health, education. The UN, regional human rights bodies like the OECD, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, NGOs, think tanks, and academics have all catalogued the social, political, and to greater or lesser extents, the human rights implications of corruption. At the individual country level, India has attracted an enormous amount of attention, but other countries have also been scrutinized, especially in Southeast Asia and Africa. What is less discussed and debated in human rights circles is whether the very act of corruption is itself a human rights violation. A violation, that is, of a as yet unspecified right, such as the right to freedom from corruption that I'm here proposing. Surprisingly, perhaps we can find at least as much support for this idea in the body of international anti-corruption agreements as we can in international human rights agreements. The UN's Convention Against Corruption, the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption, and especially the African Union's Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption, all make contextual references to the political, social, and ethical, as well as economic dimensions of corruption in their preambles. But while international human rights bodies have not been silent on the matter, the fact that corruption is not expressly provided for in any of the major international human rights instruments has meant that the issue has had to be inferred. UN treaty bodies have increasingly made references to the need for governments to combat corruption in order to deliver upon their human rights obligations. The Human Rights Committee, the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Committee, and the Committee on the Rights of the Child have all urged states to tackle corruption, especially in respect of the state's stewardship of private sector enterprise in its formal and its informal dealings with government. These treaty bodies tell us that without serious and effective domestic laws, policies, and practices for combating corruption involving the collusion between government officials and private actors, the realization of human rights for many people is significantly compromised. The UN Human Rights Council and the Commission before it undertook baseline research and passed resolutions concerning the links between human rights and corruption over the past decade, but without, it must be said, without evident enthusiasm or widespread support amongst the member states. That said, in the last 2 years or so, there has been a discernible increase in pressure from certain quarters within the Human Rights Council. One group of states is advocating, for example, that the Council take more seriously the issue and has flagged in a 2012 statement sponsored, it was flagged in a 2012 statement sponsored by Morocco. The Human Rights Council's Advisory Committee is currently engaged in an inquiry into the negative impact of corruption on human rights. And an earlier version of this paper I submitted to that inquiry. The Advisory Committee's report, which is due in June this year, may well include a recommendation for the establishment of a UN Special Rapporteur on the subject, which would undoubtedly give the matter a greater impetus and higher profile. Thus far, these UN efforts have stopped short of consideration of any freestanding right to freedom from corruption, let alone advocating the establishment of it. Corruption is, as I said, viewed exclusively as a vehicle for the infringement of other human rights, rather than being seen also as a breach of a fundamental freedom, that freedom being to be free from corruption. So, in this last part of the talk, I want to defend what my argument is for a right to freedom from corruption by very briefly addressing three questions. One, why do we need such a right? Two, what would it look like? And three, would it do any good? Why do we need it? Well, first and foremost, a right to freedom from corruption will recognize the importance of corruption, to appreciate its immensely corrosive impact on the very nature of the human rights project, namely that all of us are equal in dignity and worthy of equal respect, regardless of one's position, power, or wealth. A freestanding right highlights these essential qualities and focuses attention on states' obligation to govern fairly, equitably, and legally, and thereby to eliminate, or at least to minimize, the attraction and especially the apparent acceptability of corruption. This then is the basis for the normative impact that I claim of the right. That is a clear and express declaration of the impropriety of such action based on the fact that it's a violation of human rights, establishes a standard that only the most willfully blind or simply heedless can ignore. And they, I would add, are the sorts of corrupt actors against which deterrence is never going to work, or at least seldom, and therefore, for me, are outside the concerns of this paper, dangerous though they are. Another reason closely linked to this first one is that the discrete human rights, right to freedom from corruption, will assist in the broader human rights concern of bolstering governance to enhance the capacity, the efficiency, and the fairness of government. By mandating states to recognize freedom from corruption as a human rights issue, a new, powerful, normative dimension would be added to the efficiency and effectiveness arguments for why states need to act against corruption, which are presently dominated by the concern to criminalize such conduct. Illicit state capture by private interests is indeed a criminal matter. But it is also one that is political, social, and economic. And so, by way of pronouncing that such actions constitute a systemic breach of a basic human right, these broader concerns are made more emphatic. A third reason why we need the right to freedom from corruption is that such a focus on states' human rights obligations to combat corruption, regarding in particular misuse of public power by corporations, provides a new foothold in that debate. The right to freedom from corruption would extend the current 2011 guiding principles on business and human rights, which presently are ambiguous about whether they have internal and extraterritorial impact on businesses. Finally, the boldest jurisprudential claim I would make of a new right to freedom from corruption is that it might be seen as a sort of missing link between economic, social, and cultural rights on the one hand, and civil and political on the other. Its subject matter, corruption, recalls how the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the mother of the fraternal twins, the covenants, saw open, free, and representative government as integral to the protection and promotion of human rights. That's Article 21 of the Universal Declaration. Albeit, curiously, the Declaration refrains from any direct mention of corruption. The right to freedom from corruption is more useful and is a more useful and convincing vehicle through which to forge an argument for the interdependence of economic, social, and civil and political rights than the oft-made assertion that they are indivisible, which in practice they clearly are not. So what would this look like, this right? Well, in terms of international law, the right to freedom from corruption can take a number of forms. They range from the grand, the establishment of a new human rights treaty to combat corruption, or the recognition of its status as a crime under international criminal law, through to the very minimalist, that is, the different aspects of the right to freedom from corruption being actively inferred, as is largely the case now, in various existing human rights treaties. Additionally, at the softer end of this spectrum, it might be argued that an individual's and a society's expectations to be free from corruption constitutes a part of corporate social responsibility. At the global level, this is represented by, for example, the inclusion of corruption in the UN Global Compact, the 10th principle there, in the UN framework of guiding principles on business and human rights, which demand that corporations exercise due diligence in all their commercial dealings, and also demands that states and corporations provide remedies for any breaches. And it's also evident in the OECD guidelines for multinational corporations, which press states to encourage, is the word it uses, corporations within their jurisdiction not to engage in bribery. For me, however, the most effective and practicable option would be to incorporate the new right in a pair of optional protocols, one appended to each of the two covenants, the ICAC and the ICCPR. Not the least attractive aspect of this option would be the unequivocal statement it would make about its capacity to bridge the two sets of rights, as I argued earlier. Being framed in optional protocols to the existing covenant would emphasize the systemic nature of the right to freedom from corruption. That is, something that is integral to the realization of the full breadth of civil, political, and economic, social, and cultural rights that states are bound to uphold under international human rights law. As a pair of optional protocols, what is more, the model would also avoid many of the startup problems that plague entirely new human rights treaties. Finally, would it do any good? The acid question, the acid test. As is so often the case with international law, any positive answer to the question hinges on the strength of the nexus between the promise embedded in a state's ratification of an international instrument and the facts of its willingness and capacity to implement the promise in domestic law, policy, and practice. That said, one of the strongest factors in favor of the potential acceptance of a right to freedom from corruption is the existing evidence of widespread acceptance across states of the necessity to correct and combat corruption at international law. There are now some 171 states, signatories and ratifications to the UN Convention Against Corruption, so that's nearly all. The OECD Bribery Convention has 40 members, including 6 non-OECD members, as well as a number of other non-OECD members holding observer status. Regional anti-corruption initiatives now exist in the Americas and in Africa, and important sector-specific agreements have been established, such as the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which now has 25 compliant countries, 16 candidate countries and 4 suspended countries, so something is worth it. Adding an international human rights instrument to this lot would add to the existing armory employed in the battle against corruption, which I suggest to be both politically attractive and practically useful. Further evidence of the potential support for the idea can also be obtained from those domestic anti-corruption regimes that have had some success in terms of securing prosecutions or simply being prophylactic. Such regimes, it must be admitted, are few and far between. But while a great many states outlaw corruption and related nefarious conduct, few do so unambiguously and with robust and effective enforcement. But certainly, the trailblazing US Foreign and Corrupt Practices Act in 1977 is one such regime, and the UK's still new Bribery Act in 2010 promises to be another. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act has been characterized as operating effectively as a human rights protecting statute, in that it deters overseas corporations from human rights abuses by forcing American-listed corporations to be more honest brokers in their dealings with governments and communities. Indeed, an essential aspect of the domestic application that would be expected of a right to freedom from corruption is that it would put in place precisely the sort of criminalization of corrupt conduct that the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the Bribery Act in the UK provide. In Australia, at the national level, we are as yet to have a specific anti-corruption legislation, together with a specific federal version of the New South Wales ICAC, despite there being a plan for such drawn up by the last government, sitting on the current government's shelves. And on the question of what good a right to freedom from corruption would do, I'd like to focus on the human nature of the good that sits alongside the bad in us all, and in so doing counter the appeal of allowing ourselves to manufacture a belief that bad behaviour can somehow be excused as good. The philosopher Michael Sandel tells an interesting tale of people's fidelity to an inner moral code in his book, What Money Can't Buy. A study of Swiss villagers' attitudes towards the prospect of potential nuclear waste dump in their village revealed a surprising majority in favour, representing 51%, so just a majority. Apparently, a strong sense of civic duty and it has to go somewhere attitude. Not sure whether that would apply in Australia, but anyway, it did in Switzerland. But far more intriguing was the follow-up fact that in a follow-up survey, in which the same people were offered a financial sweetener to consent to the site being in their village, the number went down, less than 50%, and apparently they were affronted by the idea that their decision-making would be influenced by a money incentive. But one might respond by saying that this represents a particularly peculiarly middle-class Western, or in this case, Swiss attitude. Now, that may be so, but the Swiss, and especially the West generally, are also at the same time the most eager and successful exponents of secrecy banking, which is widely and well understood as the legal code for hiding many financial misdeeds. So perhaps Sandel's tale exposes most of all the differences between those who make the rules and those who are ruled by them. Rose Ackerman, in her seminal work on corruption, homes in on this nexus between the government and the government, seeing it as a point of potentially positive leverage and not just one of weakness and exploitation. Ideas and moral commitments matter, she declares. With the right leadership, facilitated by incentives born of the appropriate political circumstances, social moods, and legal or institutional tools, corrupt governments and corrupted societies can change. Thereby, Rose Ackerman argues, the necessary cultural changes may be instigated and sustained by a virtuous cycle of well-meaning people, merit employees, she calls them, and good deeds that they do, including, I would add, that one would work against the harmful effects of self-delusion. A right to freedom from corruption enshrined in international law would, I suggest, add to that cycle. Let me conclude, therefore, by pointing to an even broader opportunity that lies before us and suggest that it might conceivably provide, the right to freedom from corruption, might conceivably provide a catalyst to get a new idea over the line. The Millennium Development Goals are nearing their 2015 deadline, and amid all the discussion that is already building serious momentum as to what should follow them, large calls are being made for the explicit recognition of, one, the importance of human rights, and two, the promoting of just and accountable government alongside the rule of law, including and especially tackling corruption to the achievement of development goals. The somewhat tired argument for a human rights-based approach to development might receive a much-needed transfusion of new perspective, vigor, and relevance if it sought to back the idea of a right to freedom from corruption. The shared concerns of development practitioners and human rights advocates to enhance governance and combat corruption in both the developing and the developed world provides a welcome bridge between the two disciplines. To be sure, the path ahead for a right to freedom from corruption will not be easy. The political forces ranged against its endorsement, let alone the practical problems facing its implementation, will be enormous, to say nothing of the powerful political and vested interests that will oppose the idea tooth and nail. Cultural arguments will also be raised in opposition, that one man's corruption is another's culture. But the mouths from which such arguments come are nearly always those whose interests are being served by corruption. Time and time again, when ordinary folk are asked about what ails them about their governments and the way they're ruled by them and the corporations that employ them, they have the same lament. We know about it. It's a fact of daily life. We don't like it and we think it's unfair, but we can do little about it. Corruption is not a new phenomenon. It is as old as society itself. And as such, I must confess to being somewhat baffled by the fact that a sincere proclamation set against it and seeking its eradication did not form part of the modern post-Second World War era of international human rights law. The many international human instruments that have been established over the past 70 years have addressed an enormous variety of social, economic, and political ills of our human society, but not corruption. Maybe it was considered too prosaic a matter, or too complex, or maybe just shunted off into the too hard basket, or perhaps collective self-denial of the nature or extent of the problem effectively shoved the matter under the carpet. A cynic might say that there were too many vested interests, especially as tied up in the decolonization decades following the Second World War, to raise sufficient support for the idea, even within the international human rights community. Whatever the reason, surely its time has come now. The long missing right to freedom from corruption is ripe for debate and, one sincerely hopes, ready for enactment and, above all, enforcement. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David, very much indeed. That's a very stimulating lecture and one with a great deal of depth and research. As you all think about some questions and comments, and I do ask you to come forward with questions and comments, keep them as brief as you can. I might just mention, David, that one of the priorities for the Human Rights Commission over the next couple of years at least is on developing a relationship between business and human rights. And we've been looking at really the very nuts and bolts, very practical end of some of these issues. Discrimination in employment we get, as you know, nearly 18,000 complaints a year. A majority of those, in fact, concern discrimination on the grounds of disability in the employment context. So we're understanding that in order to have an impact on human rights in the community, we've really got to engage much better with the business community generally. And of course, corruption does come up in this context. But I wonder, could you give us some sort of practical examples of how, in that wonderful phrase you use about corruption indicating that states are really not managing properly, some practical examples? And you mentioned, I think, trial procedures and access to resources. Are there some that really stand out for you as being outcomes of corrupt practices that are not properly managed by the state?
You mean, sorry, I'm not quite clear, what do you mean outcomes as a consequence of private sector corruption or private sector corruption of public sector power?
Look, it could be both, but I was thinking of private sector corruption that has an impact on
well,
the rights of the individual. If we're talking about state corruption or failure to properly manage, then we could be talking about criminal law procedures and so on.
Well, yes, there are two extremes here, and one has to be careful when one's being recorded, but one makes it clear that these are two extremes. One extreme, which is sort of easy and straightforward, is the oil for food scandal 10 years ago, and indeed the current Leighton Holdings problems again in Iraq, where you've got bribery being perpetrated by a corporation in order to obtain a private sector benefit in another country. So it's external, but it is beneficial, and it's a jurisdictional issue for Australia because it's an Australian company. But at the other end, you have the capacity for corporations to exert enormous influence and thereby gain very substantially in a way that, at least at the moment, is not considered to be corrupt, but yet many in this room might consider it to be nefarious, if not corrupt. I'm thinking here in particular of political corruption. There is, very interestingly, and one isn't surprised that this is the case, no exclusion, no criminalization under the Convention Against Corruption, the UN Convention Against Corruption, for political corruption. In other words, the payment of politicians, either by lobbyists, either before or after the election, provided it's above board and declared, and provided it's within the laws of the domestic state. One of the recent Supreme Court cases in the United States has opened that to an even larger degree, then it's fine. And yet there'll be many in the developing world who will point to that and say, well, your government seems to be just as much in the hands of private sector interests as you claim ours is through more open and nefarious means.
Yes, question in the front here, and then the gentleman at the back. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for a very interesting talk that got us into thinking. Corruption had been around for a very, very long time, I think as long as human civilization has existed. But that's no reason for us to take it lying down. My question is, would bringing freedom, right to be freedom from corruption as a human right, will it in itself reduce the level of corruption? The reason why I'm asking is, if you look at the successful prosecution and conviction, even in a developed nation like Australia, New South Wales, it's not that many. We had big scandals in the 80s. I'm sure many people here will remember that. Prodi, I think, Joe Prodi, all that. And at the end of it, we don't know how many got really convicted and how many did the time. And I'm told that hardly any. I could be wrong. So unless that part of it is also tightened, will this in itself reduce the level of corruption, even in a developed nation? I'm not going to a developing country where things are much worse.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I was trying to make clear that this all depends on the nexus between international and domestic. So of itself, which means international, no. But all international law is about the domestic law picking up what the international law is declared as normative. So yes, it's about the implementation at the domestic level. But my point in this is that it's not so much going to deter the really bad guys. They're just going to do it in any case. And I'm not saying that's a good thing. What I am trying to deter are those who would otherwise be happy to justify to themselves, actually, it's all right. Whereas at least one of the benefits that a human rights statement, this is a violation of people's human rights, would have, one of the benefits of that, is that that simply makes it so clear that it is not all right for you to justify or to reason this away. That's the line that I think. Now, I accept that that may seem at one level quite ephemeral, but we're dealing with a very difficult and slippery subject, and any steps that we can get on this are beneficial steps.
Yes.
Thank you, David. What I feel is you are going on a global level. I said let us start from our feet, bottoms up. I'll give you a concrete example. Undersill Council, where ADOB lives. Since September, gross violation of laws is going on. So in January, I gave written application. I want to address the council on this issue. Everybody got frightened. I didn't ask, I want to see mayor. Mayor says invitation to me, would you please come and see me? I go there. He takes documents to me. Can you leave this with me? I will attend to it. 2 months have passed. Nothing happened. I went to inquire. Oh, sorry, our office got flooded. Say, how conveniently they lose the documents? Our office got flooded. So last week, I went personally. Acting general manager comes to me. Oh, they were not earlier ready to see me when I sent them emails, hundreds of emails. Now they want to see me.
Can you move to your question?
No, exactly. So day before yesterday, again he says, can you leave it with me? I will fix it. I will send our officer. They have not done anything. Meanwhile, that corrupt behavior, somebody is using public property inconvenience public goes on for last 4 months. Nobody wants to act. So David, what you are doing is pointing finger at United Nations, America, all those things. You have been living in Australia, Melbourne, here. Are you ready to do it? I'll give my personal example. I was in Melbourne in 1988. I went in the morning in Ombudsman office to complain.
What the question is?
No, this is a challenge for you. 1988, I went in Ombudsman office to give complaint. In Ombudsman office, they won't accept my complaint. At 5 p.m., one of the staff member attacked me, torn off my clothes.
Okay.
I came to Sydney.
Okay. Look, I think the point that you're making.
Do you want to take up this case?
No, I don't. I'm not going to take up the case in the public arena.
That's what I'm saying. Because we talk, we don't do anything.
But the point that I was making was in fact response to the first question. That is, I'm not talking about an international arena alone. I'm talking about how the international provides a normative standard that is implemented at the domestic level. And if you do have poor implementation of anti-corruption standards, and that you may be providing examples of that poor implementation, then that is exactly the sort of stuff that I'm saying one seeks to better repair with a stronger normative human rights declaration at the top.
Thank you. A question over here.
Thank you, Ms. Kinley. My question is quite short. What do you make of the argument that reduction of corruption is a means by which we achieve other human rights as opposed to human right in and of itself?
Unquestionably. You reduce corruption, you will unquestionably assist human rights, because, and it's particularly in those circumstances where people are most in the developing world. Because there, the leaky bucket syndrome means that you're drilling holes in the bucket of aid that comes in full of water. By the time it gets to the people that really need it, it's all been drawn off. So clearly, and that's the reason why, as I mentioned earlier, and they're not necessarily doing a good job about it, but as I mentioned earlier, why the aid communities are focusing more and more, not just on building bridges and hospitals and schools, important though those are, but also on the manner in which governance is perpetrated in the institutions that are flying in an ombudsman from Scandinavia and dropping it in Indonesia or whatever circumstance. It doesn't necessarily work, but the idea to try and bolster the institutional services to prevent corruption is precisely so that it will have a trickle-down effect, which will be that more water in the bucket will get to those who desperately need it. And there I'm saying people's human rights being protected and desperately need.
Yes, there's another gentleman.
Hi. To one man, it's a culture, the other is corruption. In the Middle East, India, Africa, and China, as a matter of fact, this is a structure. It's a roller coaster business, as you mentioned earlier. Multinational company, you encourage them to invest there for one reason, because there always a hidden fees being there for the authorities or the government. What about here in Australia or in the Western world about the lobbies for the political party? There is a hidden corruption there.
Indeed, my response to Julian's question, I think that's right. It's a situation in which lobbyists have power over politicians who have power over the public purse. And if that's the case, then you can have things like, now this is again, I have to be careful. This is legal, but just a minute. This is legal. This circumstance I'm about to tell you is legal, but would we say it's appropriate and fair? We have a circumstance now post the global financial crisis.
But how is it going to be illegal?
I haven't finished it. Yeah. Post the global financial crisis, where the banks have in effect got a guarantee from the government. They've got a guarantee backing up their losses. Now that guarantee has not been removed, it's been reduced but not removed since the global financial crisis. Why is that there, and are they paying for it? Why is it there? Because it was felt systemically necessary. Are they paying for it? No. Why are they not paying for it? Because the banks have enough power to be able to lobby government, to be able to say, we don't pay for this, but you do need us, and you do need to put that there. Now, that sort of private benefit is what it should perhaps be paid for.
What about the turning favor for the group lobby if they have paid money for the election campaign? then they have to ask for favor for the development.
Absolutely.
For development, we're not talking about the $3,000 bottle of wine here. We're not talking about that.
Yeah.
We're talking about like the developer. The developer everywhere, especially the state government.
But that is particularly the case in the United States. Particularly the case in the United States. I mean, the University of Princeton has done a review of how much it costs to get an ambassadorship in Paris. So you put in enough money to the government, to the party that wins government, you may then, if you put enough in, get a Parisian ambassadorship or a London one, whatever. These things.
Muhammad, in fact, he used to bait a politician there to ask a question in the parliament in the United Kingdom.
I think we have another question here.
Hearing other people who have got various kinds of complaints, my question is, do you foresee that if there were an instrument of a new right to be free from corruption, would mean that individuals in any country or groups of individuals maybe who are affected by corruption could then take action in, say, the International Court of Justice or some similar court to that?
That's always the possibility, but it's always the second best circumstance. Every complaint that's made to the Human Rights Committee or now to the International Covenant of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Committee is always second best because it means there's been a failure at the domestic level. You only get there once you've exhausted all domestic remedies. So what you want is that this normative standard to be incorporated domestically. That's where the power is. But yes, it could be so. The optional protocol could itself become something that to the whole treaty is then open to individual complaints. But that would not be the first place to go.
We have a question here, and then the final question over there, and then I think we must let you all go. But this gentleman.
Hi, David. I think I have asked you this question some time back.
Did I not give you an answer then?
You did, actually.
It's a bad one.
Yeah, but I also put this question to government officials like in Sierra Leone and also people from big mining companies like African minerals. It's in relation to the tax and royalties that have been paid. Like we have like one of the second largest deposits of iron ore in a whole lot of minerals. But yet, when you look at the taxes that these companies are paying, it's like before it was like 0.5%. It's only now that you just moved it up a bit. Well, when I spoke to government officials, they said, well, you have other countries, Guinea and other West African countries that have the same minerals, and they are ready to like take in these corporations for even lower taxes. And so they see it as a way of outsmarting some other countries in bringing in investors. And on the side of the TNCs, the corporations, their answer was, well, when we came in, there were no structures, no railways, nothing, no roads. We have to invest, start from the ground. So it is reasonable for us to like pay that amount of tax. So what would be your response to that?
Right. See there, I think that this is the grand corruption circumstance where you have a collusion of mutual beneficiaries, the corporation and the government, because both can see benefits of having the other in their pocket. You can get the corporation to invest in the country if you give them a low enough price. In other words, the royalties are very minimal. That will be beneficial for the corporation because it pays much less and can repatriate its profits. And the benefit that is claimed from this is that we nevertheless do get some royalties. They may be pitiful, but we get them. We have no roads before, we at least now have some roads. So the way in which the normative dimension of a right to freedom from corruption would work here is to say that neither of those parties can play so fast and loose with the human rights implications of what their done deal will occasion. That becomes a human rights matter and not just a matter of really smart business dealing or really smart government dealing. Rather, there is this added dimension to it that invests a greater severity and importance into what they're doing rather than just making it a financial transaction.
So,
sorry, I must move on because we've got to tie up. We try and keep to time, close to time here. So this young lady here.
Hi everyone. Just a point that when you spoke about how a state would ratify and then there is sort of a gap between the ratification and actually executing it, how do you see if by any chance this right does come forward? How do you see that gap narrowing? Because it's a bit more sensitive than other rights and than individualistic rights. So I would just like to take your take on it.
Well, that's what you're right. I mean, of course it's sensitive. I mean, one of the reasons, as I said, I put this to the advisory committee at the UN, and they're very sensitive to it as well. That's why I try to close it as such things as being it with assistant development stuff, hence into the post-2015 Millennium Development Goals. Make it an optional protocol to existing covenants rather than making it a big, starry, fanfare, lights, bells, and whistles new covenant. Emphasize the fact that it links to other existing rights which we already see as being violated by corruption. Stress the fact that it's complementary to the criminalization under the CAC under the OECD. So in other words, let's be careful. I'm trying to fashion it and present it in a way that is as least abhorrent and as confronting as possible to states, and press the buttons that they themselves say they want to press. That is, they want to outlaw corruption. And one of the greatest benefits of the CAC, the UN CAC, is that it has included in it asset recovery aspects. And that is the thing that got the developing countries, poor countries, to sign up to it. The idea that they might get some of the ill-gotten gains back. So focus on those sorts of positives and sell the idea. It'll be all about selling.
Well, if I may then, I'd like to thank David very much indeed. This is a difficult topic, but you've given us a vision for what can be achieved through the UN process. And I certainly agree that you need those normative standards to create the culture and change within domestic law. But the last question, of course, exposes the very great difficulty of integrating those normative standards in domestic law. And unfortunately, it's a particular problem in Australia where many of the treaties that we deal with, very old treaties that you've mentioned, are not part of our domestic law. So we have a long way to go, but I think your lecture really gives us a sense of what can be achieved at the global level, and perhaps working through the UN, the Global Compact, it might be possible to get some form of protocol that would entrench this at the global level. So thank you, David. Please join me in thanking David. Yes.